In a significant turn of events in the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, discussions around a potential ceasefire and peace negotiations have gained traction. As the war enters its third year, recent developments highlight both the complexities of the situation and the fragile hope for resolution. On April 21, Russian President Vladimir Putin expressed a willingness to engage in direct talks with Ukraine for the first time since the early days of the conflict, signaling a potential shift in Moscow's strategy. However, this openness comes in the wake of escalating violence and accusations from both sides regarding violations of a temporary truce. The backdrop to these discussions is marked by the expiration of Putin's self-declared Easter ceasefire on April 21, which lasted just 30 hours. Both Ukraine and Russia accused each other of breaching the truce thousands of times, with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy characterizing the ceasefire as a fake PR exercise by the Kremlin. In a statement, Zelenskyy reiterated his call for a comprehensive ceasefire, emphasizing the need to halt strikes on civilian infrastructure as recent attacks have resulted in casualties, including 6 deaths reported in a single day. Putin's spokesperson Dmitry Peskov acknowledged that Russia is willing to consider Zelenskyy's proposal for a moratorium on attacks against civilian infrastructure. However, he did not provide any specific plans for negotiations, highlighting the ongoing complexities in reaching a meaningful agreement. Experts note that while Putin's newfound willingness for dialogue may appear promising, it is essential to remain cautious given the historical context of Russia's commitments. In the midst of these developments, U.S. officials are intensifying their diplomatic efforts. A senior aide to Putin announced that Donald Trump's peace envoy Steve Witkoff is expected to visit Moscow for the 4th time this week to facilitate ceasefire talks. Concurrently, discussions involving US, UK, French, and Ukrainian officials are set to take place in London, underscoring the international dimension of the conflict and the heightened urgency for a resolution. US officials have described this week as critical for securing a lasting peace, with the possibility of withdrawing from negotiations if tangible progress is not made. Adding to the tension, Dutch intelligence has reported that Russia is ramping up hybrid attacks on Europe, warning that the threat could escalate following the war's conclusion. This has raised concerns about the broader implications of the conflict, with experts suggesting that the situation could further destabilize European security if not addressed adequately. As the war continues, the humanitarian impact remains severe, with reports of significant casualties and destruction in regions like Kharkiv and Odessa. The conflict has not only devastated local populations but has also strained international relations, with NATO members actively discussing their military responses should the situation escalate further. Looking ahead, the coming days will be pivotal in determining whether the current dialogue leads to a ceasefire and negotiations that could pave the way for lasting peace. The international community remains watchful, balancing hopes for resolution with the realities of ongoing violence and geopolitical tensions. The path to peace remains fraught with challenges, but the willingness to engage in dialogue may serve as a crucial step toward de-escalation in this protracted conflict. As the conflict between Russia and Ukraine intensifies, recent drone strikes have underscored the ongoing toll of warfare on civilian life and infrastructure. On April 22, 2025, Russian drones targeted the city of Kherson, striking a hospital and injuring 6 individuals, including medical personnel and funeral service employees. The assault highlights a troubling trend as drones increasingly become a weapon of choice in modern warfare, resulting in significant civilian casualties. Oleksandr Prokudin, the head of the Kherson Oblast Military Administration, confirmed the strike via telegram, revealing that the injured ranged in age from 19 to 65. In a grim illustration of the attack's impact, ambulances and civilian vehicles were also damaged, illustrating the indiscriminate nature of such assaults. The injuries sustained were primarily from blast effects and shrapnel wounds, further emphasizing the dangers faced by non-combatants in conflict zones. This attack was not an isolated incident. On the same day, Russian forces launched drone strikes in Kharkiv, injuring 7 people, and targeted the city of Kupiansk, also in Kharkiv Oblast, with guided aerial bombs. The escalated use of drone warfare has raised alarms. as it not only poses a direct threat to life but also disrupts essential services such as healthcare. The backdrop of these attacks coincides with a critical juncture in peace negotiations, with the United States proposing a peace plan that controversially recognizes Crimea as part of Russia. This proposal has been met with skepticism and concern from Ukrainian officials who fear that such concessions could undermine their sovereignty and embolden further aggression from the Kremlin. As the situation evolves, air defense systems in Ukraine have reported intercepting a significant number of incoming Russian drones. On April 21, it was reported that Ukrainian forces successfully shot down 38 out of 54 drones launched by Russia, demonstrating the efficacy of their air defense capabilities. Nonetheless, the sheer volume of drone attacks indicates a persistent threat that cannot be easily mitigated. The implications of these developments are profound and multifaceted. The increasing reliance on drones in warfare not only escalates the risk to civilian populations but also complicates international diplomatic efforts aimed at resolving the conflict. As both sides remain entrenched in their positions, the humanitarian impact of ongoing violence continues to mount. Looking ahead, the international community will be closely monitoring the situation, particularly as peace talks continue to unfold. The dynamics of the conflict are shifting and the potential for further escalation remains high. Analysts suggest that the resolution of this conflict will require not only military strategy but also a robust diplomatic framework capable of addressing the complex realities on the ground. As the world watches, the urgent need for a sustainable peace solution has never been more critical. In a surprising development amidst the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin has indicated a willingness to engage in ceasefire negotiations with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The remarks made during a television interview come at a time when both nations are under increasing pressure from the United States to reach a peace agreement. "We need to sort this out," Putin stated, suggesting that discussions might even occur bilaterally, which marks a notable shift in tone after more than 3 years of hostilities sparked by the Russian invasion in February 2022. The timing of Putin's comments coincides with a senior U.S. official's assertion that this week is critically important for securing a truce. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov emphasized that Ukraine must take steps to facilitate dialogue, asserting that Putin has consistently expressed readiness for negotiations. However, analysts remain skeptical about the sincerity of these overtures, given that Putin's fundamental objectives appear unchanged, focusing on solidifying territorial gains in Ukraine and preventing its NATO membership. In response to Putin's openness to dialogue, President Zelenskyy conveyed Ukraine's readiness for discussions, particularly regarding a ceasefire that would protect civilians. "Ukraine stands by its offer, at the very least not to strike civilian infrastructure," he remarked, underlining a commitment to minimizing harm to non-combatants. Nonetheless, the backdrop of this call for peace is stark. Russian military strikes persist unabated, with recent attacks resulting in civilian casualties across multiple Ukrainian cities, including a deadly strike on an apartment building in Zaporizhia that left one woman dead and at least 20 others injured. The apparent contradiction between Putin's statements and the ongoing military aggression raises questions about the Kremlin's true intentions. While both leaders express a desire for peace, the lack of direct talks since the early days of the invasion reveals the deep chasm that remains between them. Zelenskyy's proposal for a 30-day cessation of strikes on civilian infrastructure highlights the precarious nature of any potential agreement, as it requires significant concessions from Russia, something the Ukrainian leadership has previously considered tantamount to surrender. Adding to the complexity, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has hinted at a possible shift in American policy should progress on a peace deal not materialize, stating, "We're not going to continue with this endeavor for weeks and months on end." This pressure is compounded by concerns that a lack of resolution could lead to further instability in the region. As both leaders prepare for upcoming meetings in London, where Zelenskyy will consult with senior American and European officials, the stakes could not be higher. The outcome of these discussions may significantly influence the trajectory of the conflict, with Zelenskyy noting that the primary task will be to advocate for an unconditional ceasefire. While there are glimmers of hope in the form of diplomatic overtures, the reality on the ground remains grim, with continued hostilities underscoring the fragile nature of any potential peace process. As the international community watches closely, the coming days could prove pivotal in shaping the future of Ukraine and its ongoing struggle against Russian aggression. In an unexpected turn of events, Russian President Vladimir Putin has expressed a willingness to engage in ceasefire discussions with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. This shift comes amid increasing pressure from the Trump administration, which is keen on brokering a peace deal in a conflict that has persisted for over 3 years. Speaking to a state TV reporter, Putin remarked, "We need to sort this out," maybe even bilaterally signaling a potential opening for dialogue. His comments follow a senior U.S. official's assertion that the coming week is critically important for securing a truce. However, the Kremlin appears to be placing the onus on Ukraine to pave the way for negotiations. Dmitry Peskov, spokesperson for the Kremlin, stated that Kyiv must attempt steps to clear the way for talks, reiterating Putin's claims of readiness for negotiations. Despite the olive branch extended by Putin, analysts note that there is little evidence to suggest a shift in his fundamental war objectives, which include solidifying territorial gains in Ukraine and preventing its NATO accession. Zelenskyy responded cautiously to Putin's overture, asserting Ukraine's readiness for discussions that would halt attacks on civilians. Nevertheless, Ukraine stands by its offer, at the very least not to strike civilian infrastructure, he emphasized. The lack of direct talks between the two nations raises concerns about the sincerity of these peace overtures, particularly as both sides face mounting pressure from the U.S. administration to achieve a resolution. In parallel, Zelenskyy is preparing for a visit to South Africa, his first, to strengthen bilateral ties and potentially discuss peace negotiations. The visit comes at a time when South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has been involved in diplomatic efforts to mediate the conflict. Experts suggest that discussions with Ramaphosa could touch on the ongoing war, although specific expectations for tangible outcomes remain guarded. As the situation evolves, the backdrop of military action persists. Reports indicate that Russia has launched renewed attacks on Ukrainian cities, including Odessa and Zaporizhia, even as ceasefire discussions are on the table. These strikes have exacerbated concerns about the viability of any negotiations, with Zelenskyy calling for a 30-day halt to strikes on civilian infrastructure as a show of good faith from Russia. While U.S. President Trump has expressed optimism about the potential for a peace deal, stating that both sides could hopefully reach an agreement this week, the Kremlin has cautioned against rushing negotiations. Peskov highlighted the complexity of the settlement process and warned that imposing tight deadlines could complicate the situation further. The landscape is increasingly fraught with challenges as both Ukraine and Russia gear up for a significant military campaign in the coming months. Analysts note that the ongoing conflict has seen significant civilian casualties, with over 12,000 reported deaths since the onset of war in February 2022. In light of this, the international community watches closely as Zelenskyy meets with allies, including U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who has hinted that the U.S. might reconsider its engagement if progress is not evident. As the situation develops, all eyes will remain on the diplomatic efforts emerging from South Africa and London, with the hope that sustained dialogue may yet lead to a genuine cessation of hostilities. The complexity of the issues at stake, including territorial disputes and the future of Ukraine's sovereignty, suggests that any resolution will require not just goodwill but also substantial concessions from both sides. Whether this week will mark a turning point in the quest for peace remains uncertain, but the stakes have never been higher.